The sky over Harlan County bled the color of a wound that would not close. A woman stood alone in front of a barn that leaned like it was tired of standing. Her hair was silver and loose, caught by a wind that smelled of dry grass and coming rain. She was 62 years old, and she had not spoken a full sentence to another human being in 3 days, and she did not think that was unusual anymore. Inside the corral in front of her, a horse paced like a prisoner who had forgotten why he was caged. He was large, black where the light did not touch him, brown where it did. His neck was arched with a kind of fury, and there were scars, white and pink and old, running along his chest like a map of something terrible. He swung his head toward the fence and showed her his eyes, dark and full of something that was not animal, too knowing, too damaged to be ordinary wildness. Selah did not move toward him. She did not move away either. She stood there in the last copper light of evening, and then, without planning to, the way you breathe without deciding, she let 3 low notes leave her lips. A whistle, soft, rising and falling, the kind of sound that belongs to no instruction book, the kind that was made between 2 people just 2 years ago in a field that no longer existed in any form except her memory. The horse stopped, not gradually, not the slow settling of an agitated animal. He stopped as if the sound had reached through his skin and pulled something tight inside him into stillness. His ears came forward. He turned his massive head. And then, in the silence of that bleeding Texas evening, Major pressed his face against the fence rail and made a sound in his chest that was not quite a whinny and not quite a cry. And Selah's hand went to her mouth because she recognized it for what it was. Grief answering grief. She had thought she was only doing a favor for a sick neighbor. She had thought she was only filling 3 empty weeks with labor instead of silence. She had not thought the truth had been locked in a barn 8 miles from her own front door for 5 years, waiting for the sound of her dead son's whistle to finally come home. The house Selah lived in had 4 rooms, and every one of them was too large. She had learned early, in the months after the accident, that size was a form of cruelty when you were the only thing left to fill it. The kitchen table seated 6. She ate standing at the counter with a bowl of soup she sometimes forgot to taste. The hallway was lined with 3 coat hooks, hers, her husband Daniel's, and Marcus's, her son. She had never taken their coats down. She could not explain this if pressed. She simply could not. Daniel had been 58 when the car went off the road. Marcus had been 31, recently married, recently happy in a way that had made Selah begin to believe the world was safe. Both gone on a night in November 5 years prior, on a road they had driven 100 times, in weather that was bad but not terrible, on a curve that should have held them. The official report said, loss of control on a wet road. No other vehicle involved. She had never believed that. She had no evidence to disbelieve it, only the small, cold certainty that lived below her sternum, below argument, below reason, the feeling that something was left uncounted. She had eventually stopped saying so. People began to look at her differently when she said it, and she had grown to hate the kind of silence that followed. So she kept the feeling inside, and it kept her awake, and the years went by, and the house stayed large. Neighbors brought food at first, then they stopped. The town of Granger Fork was not unkind. It was just busy with its own living, the way small towns are. Selah understood. She did not hold it against anyone. She had her garden, her chickens, her 3 mornings a week at the feed store in town where she signed invoices for supplies that kept arriving and said few words to anyone and went home again. It was enough to keep breathing. It was not enough to feel alive. Ridge Calloway called on a Tuesday morning in late September. She had known Ridge since before Daniel, since she and Daniel had first built their place out on the county road, and Ridge had shown up with a casserole dish and a handshake that meant he intended to be a permanent fixture. He had been a large, sun-creased man then, loud in the way of people who laugh easily. He was 81 now, and the illness had taken most of the large out of him, and she could hear it in his voice when he called. The careful way he was breathing, the pauses that were not hesitation but conservation. He had congestive heart failure. The doctors wanted him in Austin for 6 weeks. There was nobody else, he said. His son was in Oregon and had his own problems. The ranch hand had quit 3 months ago. The farm, Lonesome Creek, 12 acres, some cattle, some chickens, 1 very difficult horse, would be swallowed alive if it sat unattended. He asked her if she would consider. She almost said no. The polite kind of no that lets the person asking know you are sorry, but the answer is still no. Instead, she said, When do I start? She had surprised herself. She thought afterward that it was simply a matter of arithmetic. The farm would give her something to do with her hands, and her hands had been restless for 5 years with no sufficient task. That was all it was. Nothing more complex than that. She arrived at Lonesome Creek on a Thursday. The sight of it settled into her chest like a stone. The fences needed mending in at least 4 places she could count from the driveway alone. The barn roof sagged where a branch had hit it, probably in the last spring storm. The yard between the house and the outbuildings was overgrown with something yellowish and brittle, and the water trough near the cattle pen was green around the rim with algae. Ridge had not been managing this place. Ridge had been surviving it, which was a different thing entirely, and now even that had stopped. She was standing in the dry yard, taking inventory, when a truck pulled up behind her. A late-model pickup, clean and white and new, which told her something immediately about the man who stepped out of it. He was perhaps 50, with a pressed shirt despite the heat and the kind of smile that was perfectly assembled but did not quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Clint Mabry. Land development, he said. Local investment. He told her that Ridge had spoken with him about the property, that there was already an agreement in principle, that the outstanding debts on the land were considerable and Ridge's position was difficult, and he, Clint, had a very fair offer on the table that would clear the debts entirely and leave Ridge with something to live on. He said all of this pleasantly, with his hands in his pockets, looking not at her but past her at the land. Selah said that Ridge had not mentioned any agreement. Clint smiled again and said Ridge had a lot on his mind these days. She said she would be the caretaker of the property for the next several weeks, and that any discussions about the property's future would need to wait until Ridge was in a position to have them clearly. Clint looked at her then, for the first time directly. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not immediately name. He said, of course, no rush at all. He left his card on the porch rail and got back in his truck and drove away slowly, and she watched him go, and the feeling beneath her sternum, the old, cold, faithful feeling, stirred like something waking up. The first day was labor, pure, honest, necessary labor of the kind that empties your head of everything except what your hands are doing. She fixed the trough. She mucked the cattle stalls. She patched 2 fence lines with wires she found coiled in the equipment shed. She fed the chickens. She inventoried the hay. Ridge had left a handwritten note on the kitchen table with instructions for each animal, written in the careful letters of a man whose hands no longer cooperated perfectly with his intentions. She read it twice and followed it to the letter. Near the bottom of the note, almost as an afterthought, in smaller writing, Major is in the rear stall of the main barn. Do not open his stall. Do not attempt to move him or turn him out. He is unpredictable and has injured 2 people already this year. Just make sure he has hay and water twice daily. Slide the bucket through the lower gate. Do not go inside. She did not go inside. Not the first time. The rear stall was separated from the rest of the barn by a heavy wooden partition that Ridge had apparently built as a modification. It was newer wood than the rest, the nails still bright. There was a reinforced gate with a sliding bolt and a small lower hatch for passing feed through. She slid the hatch open and pushed a full hay net through and heard movement inside. Heavy footsteps on packed earth. A sound of breath. She slid the water bucket through and closed the hatch and stood there a moment listening. From behind the partition, Major paced. She could hear it, the 4-beat rhythm of a horse walking a too small space, back and forth, the same path worn into the same ground. She had heard the sound of caged pacing before, in dogs at the shelter she had volunteered at briefly years ago, and it had the same quality, not randomness, but repetition without destination. The saddest kind of movement. She left him that first day and did not look back. But the second day, she made the mistake of coming too close when she opened the hatch, and Major slammed his shoulder into the gate so hard that the bolt jumped in its housing, and she stepped back fast, and her heart was in her throat before she'd had time to think. She stood there breathing. Inside, Major blew a heavy breath through his nostrils and paced away and came back and pressed himself against the gate again, not striking this time, just pressing, with a kind of desperate weight. She looked through the gap between the gate boards. He was bigger than she had imagined. 16 hands at least, black-coated with a deep brown undertone, a wide chest, a neck that curved with power that had nowhere to go. His mane was tangled. He had not been brushed in some time. There were the scars she had noticed from a distance, running from his left shoulder down across his chest in uneven lines, old enough to be pale against his coat. too many and too irregular to be from a single accident. He looked at her through the gap. Not at the door, not at the hatch. At her. The way an animal looks when it is deciding whether the human in front of it is a threat or something else it does not yet have a category for. She did not look away. She did not speak to him. She did not coo or comfort. She just met his eyes and let the silence be what it was. After a long moment, he turned away and went to his water bucket. She took that as something. The days that followed had a rhythm. Mornings, she worked the cattle and the chickens and repaired whatever she found broken. Afternoons, she did the heavier things, restringing fence, clearing the drainage ditch along the north field that had silted up, hauling the broken branch sections from the barn roof area into a pile for burning. She was 62 years old and her back reminded her of this without mercy, but she kept moving because stopping was worse. She called Ridge every evening. He sounded thinner each time, not in voice exactly, but in energy, the way a person sounds when the body is consuming itself in order to keep the important parts running. She did not tell him about Clint. She should have. She had not decided yet why she did not. On the fourth evening, after dark, she sat on the overturned grain bucket outside Major's partition with her boots off and her feet sore and her hands scraped along the knuckles from the fence wire. The barn smelled of hay and animal and old wood, and the single bare bulb at the far end threw long shadows over everything. She was not thinking of anything in particular. She was very tired, and in that tired, unguarded place, the way a word you've been trying to remember surfaces only when you stop trying. She let out a breath that shaped itself into 3 notes. Low, then a step up, then a curl back down. The whistle that she and Marcus had invented in a summer when he was 9 years old, in a field she no longer owned, because they had sold the old property after the move. She could not remember now what the whistle had started as. A game, probably. A signaling thing between a mother and a child who ran too far from sight. It had become something else over the years. A hello. A check-in. A thing that meant, I'm here. Are you there? She had not made that sound since the day before the accident. She did not plan to make it now. It simply came. And Major stopped. The pacing stopped. The shuffling stopped. The constant low sound of a restless animal stopped completely. And the barn went so quiet she could hear the moths hitting the light bulb at the far end. Then she heard him come toward the gate. Not rushing. Not the explosive charge of the second day. Walking. Deliberately, slowly, placing each hoof with care. She sat still on the grain bucket and waited. His nose appeared at the gap in the gate boards. He was breathing in long, slow pulls, reading the air, reading her. She watched him and did not move. After a long time, she let out the 3 notes again, quiet as a question. His ears came forward like 2 antennas orienting toward a signal. And then he pressed his cheek against the gate boards, not straining, not fighting, just resting. And something in his huge body went softer, the way an exhale changes the shape of a thing. Selah's eyes burned. She blinked and looked at her own hands, and could not for the life of her understand what had just happened, or why it felt like it mattered so much. She could not leave it alone. This was not a decision. It was not a deliberate investigation. It was the way the cold feeling under her sternum, the one that had lived there for 5 years, woke up and started pressing against her ribs from the inside, and would not let her rest. She tested it the next morning, stood outside the gate before she slid the feed through and waited until Major was pacing, until he was in that restless, mechanical rhythm of a creature that has stopped expecting anything. Then she whistled. Low. A step up. A curl back down. He froze mid-stride, turned, came to the gate at a walk. She did it again in the afternoon, from further away, from outside the barn entirely, and heard through the wall a sound that was definitely him reacting, footsteps moving toward her direction, a soft vocalization that was not distress. She did it a 3rd time after dark, 3 notes, barely audible, while she was standing 6 feet from the gate. He came all the way to the boards, put his nose through the gap, breathed against her hand. She let him. The whistle was not a sound she had ever taught anyone else. It was not a signal from a training manual or an old cowboy trick she had picked up. It was invented, private, specific. It had existed between her and Marcus and nowhere else in the world. So how did a horse that had never met her son know it? She started going through Ridge's office the next day. It was a small room off the main house kitchen, cluttered the way old men's offices are cluttered, accumulation over intention. She was not sure what she was looking for. She told herself she was looking for Ridge's insurance papers and the land title documents and the veterinary records, all of which were things she legitimately needed. She found those things. She also looked for anything to do with Major. There were purchase records. Ridge had bought Major 18 months ago at an auction outside San Marcos. The seller was listed as a livestock relocation company, a name she did not recognize, and there was a price paid and a date signed and nothing else except a laminated health certificate from a vet she also did not recognize, a Dr. Orland in a town called Pickett Falls. The date on the auction purchase, March 14th. She had to sit down. She was sitting in Ridge's old rolling chair, in the dusty quiet of his office, staring at the number 14 on that document. Because the accident had been February 19th, and the funeral had been February 25th, and March 14th was 3 weeks and 2 days after they had buried Daniel and Marcus in the same cemetery plot they had chosen together on a hill with a view of the valley. It was not conclusive. She knew it was not conclusive. She was not a detective, and she was not irrational. 3 weeks was a coincidence, or it was something else, and she had no way to know which. She went back to the barn. She opened the gate. She had not planned this either. She told herself she was simply checking his water. She had the feed bucket in one hand, and she was moving with calm, deliberate steps, and Major stood at the back of the stall watching her with that particular watchfulness. She moved slowly to his left side and ran her palm along his neck. He let her. She moved along his side, down toward his chest, and felt the topography of the old scars under her fingers, raised and ridged and irregular. She had thought, from a distance, they were bite marks or wire cuts. Up close they were neither. The pattern was wrong for both. She crouched down, ignoring the protest of her knees, and looked along Major's chest and left foreleg, running in a diagonal pattern that crossed itself in 2 places. There were impact scars. Not linear, not puncture, the kind that metal makes against flesh when metal and flesh meet at speed. She had seen that pattern once before. In the photographs from the accident, Daniel's car, their old Subaru wagon, blue, had been photographed from every angle for the insurance report, and she had gone through those photographs more times than was healthy, looking for the thing no one else was looking for. The left front panel of the car had been destroyed, crumpled inward and down by the impact of a larger vehicle striking it from the left side and rear before the car went off the road. The pattern of that crushed metal, the specific angles, and the crossing marks, she had memorized it without meaning to. She was crouching in the stall of a barn in Harlan County, Texas, with her hand on a horse's scarred chest, and she was looking at the same pattern. She stood up. She stood very still. Major turned his head and pressed his nose gently against her shoulder. She put her hand flat on his face. Her voice, when it came, was barely a sound. "What happened to you?" He did not answer, of course. But he stayed. He pressed his weight toward her, carefully, the way a large animal learns to press carefully when it knows it could hurt and has decided not to. She whistled 3 notes. He turned his face into her neck and breathed. She went back to the records that night and found Ridge's handwriting in a folder she had not thought to open. A journal of sorts, brief daily entries about the farm, feed costs, weather, repairs. She read backward from the most recent entries, and in an entry dated 18 months ago, for days after the auction date, she found. Major arrived today. See. Says keep him in rear stall, no contact with visitors. Says the animal is dangerous, but I know a broken thing from a dangerous one. They are not the same. God forgive me, they are not the same. She read it 3 times. See. She put the journal down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, Clint Mabry's white truck was parked at the end of the drive, idling. She had not heard it pull up. The headlights were off. The engine was running. After 2 minutes, it left. She did not sleep that night. She called Ridge the next morning before the sun was fully up. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice thick with medication and early waking. She asked, where did Major really come from? Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone who has been waiting for a question for a long time and is deciding whether to answer it. She said, I read your journal, Ridge. The entry about C. I know it was Clint. More silence. She said, and I found the auction record. March 14th, 3 weeks after the accident. Ridge made a sound that was part breath and part something older. She said, I need to know what you know. He told her to lock the doors. He said it twice. Lock the doors and don't leave the property tonight. She said she understood and she waited. He had not known. At first, he said. He had believed what Clint told him, that the horse was a problem animal picked up cheap at an auction and needed somewhere to stay while Clint arranged a buyer. That was the story 18 months ago when Clint Mabry drove up with a trailer and asked Ridge to board Major in the back stall. In exchange for the boarding, and for Ridge's discretion, which Clint called a small personal favor, Clint had settled 6 months of Ridge's outstanding feed bills. Ridge had needed the money. His medical debt was already beginning. He had not asked questions. But the horse was wrong from the beginning. Too frightened, too scarred, too particular in his terror. Not the generalized skittishness of a poorly trained animal, but something sharper, more specific. Ridge had noticed it. He had started to wonder. Then Clint began coming by more often, asking questions that should not have required asking. Had anyone visited the property lately? Had Selah Voss come around since the accident? Was she the sort to investigate things? Ridge had thought that was an odd way to put it. He had started listening differently after that. To things people said around town about the accident 5 years ago. About the curve on County Road 7 where Daniel and Marcus Voss had gone off in the rain. About the fact that the road had been torn up and resurfaced 6 weeks after the accident. A project that had been applied for and approved with unusual speed. He had put together a shape. Not proof, just a shape. Clint Mabry had been at the Harlan County Cattlemen's dinner that November evening. The dinner had gone late and Clint had been drinking. And there were people who remembered this, and people who had not thought to say so to anyone official, because Clint Mabry was a useful man in a small county and the accident had been ruled an accident, and that had seemed clean enough. Clint's company had purchased the resurfacing contract. Ridge said, "I am sorry, Selah. I am sorry I didn't go to the sheriff when I started to understand. I was sick and I was scared and I told myself I didn't have enough. But I had enough. I just didn't have the courage." She asked, "Was Major in Clint's truck that night?" Ridge took a long breath and said, "I think so. I think Clint was hauling him somewhere, and the animal got loose in the crash somehow. Through the cab or the trailer gate, I don't know. And Clint had the horse, maybe in the chaos, maybe after he'd fled, and he needed somewhere to put him that wasn't traceable. And I let him." Selah was standing in the kitchen with the phone against her ear, and she was looking at the window where the morning light was coming in pale and flat, and she thought, 5 years. 5 years that horse carried those scars, and nobody said a word. She said, "All right." Ridge said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to take care of the farm." She did not say what else she was planning. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen and breathed for a long time with her eyes closed. Then she went to the barn. She opened Major's stall gate and stepped inside and brushed him for the first time. Long, slow strokes along his back and sides and haunches, working through the tangles in his mane with her fingers. He stood completely still for it, only occasionally turning his head to look back at her, as if confirming she was still there. She whistled 3 notes, very soft. He exhaled through his nose and dropped his head lower. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the way Marcus had run too far in fields when he was small, and she would whistle, 2 short notes usually, but that was the old one. And he would come back through the tall grass, and she could always hear him before she could see him. She thought about the last thing she had said to him the day before the accident, a small, unnecessary argument about a borrowed tool that was never returned, and how she had carried that for 5 years like a stone under her tongue. She thought about the fact that this horse had heard that whistle, had heard Marcus somewhere, sometime, in the hours or days before everything changed, and the sound had stayed in him, tucked in whatever place animals keep the things that have mattered, and he had been waiting for someone to speak that language again. She thought, he knows what was lost. He knows it the way she knows it. She kept brushing. Outside, at the end of the drive, she heard a truck slow down and then keep going. Clint Mabry was circling. He came to the door on a Friday evening with papers. She had been expecting him sooner. The fact that it had taken this long meant he was careful, or that he had been watching and waiting for a moment that suited him, which was more frightening. He stood on the porch with a folder and the assembled smile and said he wanted to help. He said Ridge's situation was truly unfortunate, and he had spoken with the bank, and there was really only one clean path forward, and he had made the documents as simple as possible. He held out the folder. She looked at it, but did not take it. She said, "What is this exactly?" He said, "Sale of property. A fair price, given the debt attached. Ridge gets out clean." She said, "Ridge hasn't authorized a sale." Clint said, "Ridge is a sick man. He needs things simplified." She said, "I'll simplify things for you, Clint. I know about the horse. I know where he came from." His face did not change the way she expected. The smile stayed exactly where it was, but something underneath it changed. The thing behind the smile went cold and very still, the way a body of water goes still when something large has moved below it. He said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "Yes, you do." He said, "Selah, you've been isolated a long time. Grief does things to the mind. You start finding meaning in things that aren't there. It's natural. It's understandable." She heard the condescension in it, the practiced kind, the kind you prepare in advance for when you need a woman to feel foolish. She said, "He reacts to a whistle my son made up when he was 9 years old." Clint said nothing. She said, "He has impact scars that match the damage pattern on my husband's car." Clint said, "That's not evidence of anything." She said, "It's enough to reopen an investigation." He took a small step forward on the porch, and something about the angle of his body changed. The shoulder coming forward, the weight redistributing. And Selah noticed it the way a person notices a shift in weather before they consciously identify the clouds. He said, "You should take the deal. It's a good offer. Ridge gets something, you go back to your house, and everyone moves on." She said, "Everyone has been moving on for 5 years. I'm the only one who hasn't managed it." He said, "Sign the papers, Selah." She said, "Get off this porch." He did not get off the porch. He stood there looking at her with the flat, patient look of a man who believes he will get what he wants because he has always gotten what he wants. Then he folded the papers back into the folder and tucked it under his arm. He said, "I'll be back." He left. She closed the door and stood in the hallway and let the shaking move through her arms and hands and then stop. She was not afraid of him, not exactly. She was afraid of what he was capable of, which was different. A man afraid of being exposed was more dangerous than a man simply wanting something. She called the sheriff's office and spoke to a deputy she knew slightly, a young man named Garrett who had been at school with Marcus. She told him she had some information related to a 5-year-old accident that she believed warranted a second look. She told him about the horse and the scars and the dates in Ridge's account. She told him about Clint. Garrett said he would look into it. He said it carefully, the way young deputies talk when they are unsure of their authority over a prominent local name. But she heard in his voice that he was not dismissing her. She thanked him. She did not tell him about the way Clint had shifted his weight on the porch. She asked Garrett, "If something were to happen tonight, if I activated a call alarm, how long would it take for someone to reach Lonesome Creek?" He said, 15 minutes if we're already on the county road. Maybe 20 from town." She said, "Understood." She spent the rest of that evening setting up every motion sensor light she could find in Ridge's equipment shed, aiming them at the driveway and the barn approach. She found an old emergency call button, the kind Ridge used for medical alerts, and reset it to dial the sheriff's dispatch directly. She put it in the front pocket of her jeans. She moved Major from the rear stall to a larger stall near the barn's main doors. He was calmer now than he had been, with her daily brushing and the twice-daily whistling. He still would not tolerate strangers. Earlier that week, a county extension officer who had stopped by briefly had made the mistake of walking toward the barn, and Major had screamed and kicked the wall so hard dust fell from the rafters. But with Selah he was steady. She put fresh bedding under him and filled his water and brought him a handful of the sweet feed he had recently started accepting from her palm. She whistled 3 notes. He pressed his nose into her hand. She said out loud, to no one except him, "Whatever happens tonight, I am not leaving you here." She said it the way you say something when you need to hear it with your own voice. The storm came in from the southwest just after 10. She heard it before she saw it, the particular tone the wind makes when it shifts from complaint to intention. The sky outside the kitchen window went the color of old iron, and then the first rain hit the glass in one flat sheet, and the lights flickered. She turned off every light in the house. She sat in the dark kitchen and listened to the storm. She heard his truck at 11:40. No headlights. The sound of the engine was low, and she almost missed it under the rain. But she had been listening for it the way you listen for something when you already know it is coming. She heard the crunch of the gravel at the far end of the drive, heard it stop, heard the door. She pressed the alarm button in her pocket once. The activation code she had confirmed with Garrett that afternoon. 1 press for standby, 2 presses for response. She pressed it once. She heard him try the house door first. She heard the handle. She had locked it, but she knew a locked door was not a deterrent for a man who was beyond deterrence. She was already in the barn. She had come through the back of the house and across the yard in the rain, moving along the wall, in the dark. She was inside before he made it to the porch and found the house empty. The barn was black. A single emergency light over the main door ran on battery backup, and threw a dim red glow that made everything look like the inside of something old and closed. Major was awake. He had heard the truck. She could hear him shifting in his stall, not panicked, alert. She heard Clint enter through the side barn door. He came in with a flashlight in one hand. He swept the light around and found her standing in the center of the barn floor, 10 feet from Major's stall gate. He was also holding a pistol. He said, "I don't want to do this." She said nothing. He said, "This was all manageable. You made it unmanageable." She said, "How long have you known that wasn't just an accident?" He said, "From the beginning. Obviously from the beginning." She said, "Tell me." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I have been carrying the weight of not knowing for 5 years. And you've been carrying the weight of knowing. And I think it's heavy." Something shifted in him. She had gambled on it, had gambled on the particular loneliness of a man who had kept a secret this large for this long. The way a terrible weight becomes a terrible need. He lowered the gun slightly. He said, "I had been drinking. Not enough to justify calling it drunk. Not so little that it wasn't a factor. I was hauling the horse up to my place. I'd bought him at an auction outside Kerrville. Just a cheap buy. No real reason. The road was wet. I came around the curve too fast. I clipped their car." He stopped. She waited. He said, "They went through the guardrail." I stopped. I stopped and I got out and I looked." She said, and he said, "There was nothing I could do. The car it was in the ravine. I could see the lights. I waited for the lights to go out." Her hands were fists at her sides. He said, "If I'd called it in, if I'd stayed, it would have been the end of everything. I had 3 Pennant County contracts. I had the land deal going through the commissioner's office. One call, and all of it was gone." She said, "So you left them there?" He said, "The rain was getting worse. Nobody was going to find them soon enough." She said, "My son." He did not answer. She said, very quietly, "My son was still alive when that car went into the ravine. I read the coroner's report. He lived for some part of what came after. You know that." Clint's hand with the gun came back up. He said, "Sign the papers, Selah. I have them here. You sign, I file Ridge's estate into receivership, and all of this stays what it was ruled 5 years ago." She said, "It was never going to stay anything." She said it, and she filled her lungs, and she whistled. 3 notes. Low, up, and curling back down. She put everything into it, every field, every morning, every one of the 31 years she had whistled that sound into the air of whatever world she and Marcus were sharing at the time. She whistled it the way you call back something that has been gone too long. Major exploded through the stall gate. The bolt was new. She had replaced it herself 3 days ago, a heavy sliding model, but the force behind it was not something a bolt could hold. The gate swung and crashed, and Major came through it at a speed that the narrow barn aisle translated into something enormous and unstoppable, a black shape moving fast in the red-tinged dark, and he knew. She would think about this later, the knowing. How a horse arrived at the specific geometry of recognition in a space of 2 seconds in a dark barn in a rainstorm. She would think about whether animals carry certain memories in a place below thought, the way fear bypasses reason, and whether the smell of a man or the angle of a silhouette or simply the presence in that particular air of the thing that had caused the worst moment of an animal's life could be communicated faster than any conscious process. Major hit Clint with his shoulder. Not a kick, not a rearing strike, a body blow, at a run. The full weight of 1,200 pounds redirected from the gate into the man who was standing in the middle of the barn floor. The gun fired. The shot went into the rafters. She heard it, the roar in the enclosed space, and then the smaller sound of wood splintering above, and then Clint was down. Major stood over him, not attacking, standing, the way a horse stands when it has made its point and is waiting to see if the point has been understood. Clint was on his back, the gun out of his reach, and he was making the low sound of a man who has had the air knocked out of him and has not yet determined the full extent of his situation. He turned his head and looked up at the horse standing over him, and he went very still in the way of a person whose nervous system has understood something that his conscious mind is still catching up to. She pressed the alarm button twice. Then she stood in the center of the barn with her hand on Major's neck, and she waited. The rain hammered the roof. Major did not move. Clint did not move. 14 minutes later, she heard the sheriff's department come up the drive. Garrett was not the only one who came. The primary cruiser was followed by 2 more units, and then a truck from the state police. Because Garrett had made a call on the way that had set something larger in motion. He had called a contact at the state attorney's office who had been, as it turned out, quietly watching a pattern of county land deals and zoning approvals connected to Clint Mabry's company for some time. The accident investigation had not been among the threads they were pulling, but it was connected, and now it was attached, and the size of the thing that began to unravel in the weeks that followed was larger than Selah had imagined. Clint was taken from the barn in handcuffs, still pale, still watching Major with an expression she did not try to interpret. He said nothing useful until he had a lawyer. Then, facing a criminal trespass charge, a weapons charge, and the mounting weight of the evidence from the accident plus Ridge's recorded testimony, which Selah had suggested Ridge make before anything else, he began to make choices about what he was willing to say. He said enough. The accident file was formally reopened by the state. The new investigation ran for 11 weeks. The old guardrail where the car had gone through, long since replaced, but documented, had fragments of a truck's undercoating in the paint analysis that had been noted in the original file and set aside. The chemistry matched a vehicle type consistent with what Clint had owned at the time. Clint's alibi for that evening, which had not been closely questioned 5 years ago because the accident had not been a crime, did not hold under the new scrutiny. He was indicted on multiple charges, including vehicular homicide and obstruction. She heard about the indictment on a Tuesday morning, sitting in Ridge's kitchen with a cup of coffee she had made with Ridge's old percolator. She sat with it for a long time. She did not cry. She felt the cold feeling under her sternum. The faithful, 5-year companion, go quiet for the first time she could remember. Not gone. Quiet. The way a storm goes quiet after it has done what it came to do. She called Ridge. He was in the hospital, and his voice was thinner than it had been, and she could hear in the pauses between words the kind of effort that breathing had become. He said, "I should have been stronger." She said, "You are strong enough now. That's what matters." He said, "The farm. I wanted to go to you. I've already spoken with the lawyer here. He has the documents." She said, "Ridge, that's not necessary." He said, "I know it's not necessary. I want to. I want to know it goes to someone who'll keep it." She said, "I'll keep it." He died 11 days later, on a Thursday, peacefully, which was a mercy, and she was grateful for it. The town showed up to his funeral in a way that surprised her. Not because she had not known he was well-liked, she had, but because they showed up for her too. After the service, people came to her with the careful, necessary apology of a community that has let someone carry something alone too long. They did not dramatize it. They did not make speeches. They simply came. The woman from the pharmacy who had watched her walk past silently for 5 years, the man from the feed store who had processed her orders without conversation, the minister who had not seen her in a church since the memorial. And they said something simple and true, and then they shook her hand or touched her arm. She received it. That was the only word for it. She opened something she had closed and received it. Young Garrett came to her after and said, "The state investigator told me you were the whole reason this moved. That without your documentation, the journal, the photos of the scars, the purchase records, there was nothing to work with." She said, "There was a horse." He looked at her for a moment and nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am. There was a horse." 8 months later, the sign at the entrance to Lonesome Creek had been repainted. The new lettering was dark green on weathered white, and it read, "Marcus Voss Memorial Ranch, Lonesome Creek." Below the name, in smaller letters, Ridge Calloway, founder. She had kept both names because both mattered. The fence lines were whole now. The barn roof had been repaired with materials donated by 3 local families who had shown up one Saturday with tools and no request for thanks. The drainage ditch along the north field ran clear. The cattle pen held 12 Angus cross heifers she had acquired at a fair price from a woman in the next county over who bred them honestly. The chickens were numerous and opinionated. On a Wednesday morning in late May, Selah was in the back pasture fixing a section of post that the heifers had been leaning on, and she heard a truck on the drive and went to meet it. It was the woman from the feed store. Her name was Darlene, who had been coming by every Thursday with supply orders and had taken it upon herself to start organizing what was now an informal rotation of community help. Different families for different days of the week. Nothing obligatory, just the kind of help that small places give themselves when they remember how. Darlene brought a casserole and set it on the porch table without ceremony and said, "New people moved into the old wicker place. Thought you might want to know. Young family, 3 kids. Selah said, "I'll bring them something next week." Darlene said, "I figured." That was the whole conversation. After Darlene left, Selah stood on the porch and looked at the yard and tried to remember what it had looked like when she arrived. The broken down, abandoned feeling of it, the sense of something past saving. She could not quite see it that way anymore. The place had a different shape now, the way a scar changes a face not to ugly but to real. She wore a blue shirt, not black. She had not decided consciously to stop wearing black. It had happened the way most real changes happen, not by decision, but by the quiet accumulation of mornings when something new felt possible. She went inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with Ridge's old journal. She read it sometimes, not the difficult entry, but the others, his daily notes about weather and animals and the ordinary satisfactions of farming. She found she liked the company of his voice in those pages. He had been a man who paid attention to small things, and she was becoming that kind of person again, and it felt like a homecoming. Marcus was in the room with her always, not the way he had been in her own house, where his absence had been a shape she was always trying not to bump into, but differently. The way someone can be present in a place they loved. She thought he would have liked this farm. She thought he would have talked to Major like a person, which was the only right way to talk to Major. She thought, I will tell him things. Out in the field, the way you tell things to someone when you are not sure of the metaphysics, but you do it anyway, because it is the only language available. She was not entirely okay. She did not expect to be entirely okay and had stopped punishing herself for it. She had her bad nights and her mornings that started with the weight back on her chest and her hands that still sometimes went to those coat hooks in her own house. She was keeping this house too, going back twice a week, with emotion that had no purpose anymore except the muscle memory of love. But the bad mornings passed, and afterward there was the farm and the animals and Darlene on Thursdays and Garrett who stopped by sometimes in his off hours to fix things that needed fixing and didn't make a production of it. And there was the specific quality of May light on the Texas hill country in the late afternoon when the air goes gold and the grasses bend. And there was Major. She came through the back pasture gate with a bucket of apple quarters cut the size she knew he preferred. The evening was warm and still, and the sky was going into its colors, peach and copper along the western edge, deepening to lavender overhead. The kind of sky that makes you stop walking without deciding to stop. She stopped and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked under the old live oak at the pasture corner, the largest tree on the property. The one Ridge had noted in his journal was older than the fence lines, older than the ranch itself, and she set down the bucket. She looked out across the open pasture. It was empty in the way that land is not empty, full of light and grass movement and the distant sound of cattle and the quality of air that comes just before evening. She took a breath. She put her fingers in her mouth the way Marcus had taught her, because he had been able to do it louder than her, and he had been proud of the difference, and she let out 3 notes. Low, a step up, a long curl down. She sent them out into the evening like something she was returning to the air. For a moment, nothing. And then, far across the pasture, in the long amber grass near the far fence, a dark shape lifted its head. A pause, a single breath of wind across the whole field, and then Major came at a full gallop. Not the desperate charge of a frightened animal, not the explosive energy of something contained too long, but the pure, clean run of a horse that knows exactly where it is going. His mane lifted behind him. His hooves threw up small puffs of dry earth, and the sound of them reached her in waves. He slowed as he neared, from a gallop to a canter to a trot, and then to a walk, and he came the last 50 feet slowly, with his ears forward and his eyes on her face, and he put his nose into her chest, and she put both arms around his neck and held on. She did not cry. She had cried what needed crying. This was something else. The truth is, it had been locked away for 5 years in a dark stall. Not only the truth about the accident, but the particular truth that love does not end at the edge of what we can explain. That it carries, that it finds its way, even through silence, even through 5 winters and the slow dismantling of the life that built it. That something as simple as 3 notes on the air, a mother's whistle, a son's invention, a signal between 2 people in an ordinary field in an ordinary summer, can survive in a creature that has no language for it, no category, only the faithful animal certainty that this sound means, I am here. Are you there? She was here. He was there. They stood under the oak as the sky went full purple and the first stars appeared, one by one, without any hurry. If this story reached something in you, something quiet or something old, then let it. Pass it on to someone who needs to hear that truth has a way of coming home. and that love speaks a language the years cannot erase.